So the reason we're talking today is Abil has written a paper, and
Well, we've written a paper.
and we have written a paper. He has graciously included me in this. It's based on a lot of my material, but the paper is the impact of sex on strength training in adults with cardiovascular disease, and it appeared in the journal Clinical Therapeutics. And I think has that thing been assigned a publication date and that thing, or is this just preprint?
It's available online, so it's published as of.
Well, it was
When did I send
accepted
this to you?
January 9th.
Yeah, yeah, that's the date as of which it's published. I would surmise. No, maybe January 30th.
It says accepted for publication January 9th. So that
Yeah.
means that the peer review went through and the editor said, all right, we'll run it on January the 9th.
Yeah.
Right. And this is a fairly important piece of publication because now this is in, as they say, the literature. And this is stuff that we all know, but that nobody else really has thought about. So, Abil, why don't you summarize this thing for us? Because
Sure.
this is very valuable.
Well, Rip, maybe we give it a little bit of background also, right? And
Okay.
tie it back to my last visit with you a couple of years ago. And at that time, the impetus for that visit was a question that I had asked you at one of your training seminars. I think it was back in the spring of 2018 when you had come out to Maryland and I'd come down for the weekend-long seminar. And at your Q&A at the end of that session, I asked you the question, does strength allow people to live longer? And your answer to that, as I would have expected, was yes. But then you challenged me to say, well, what's the basis for that? And that's really what you and I started talking about. And so when I came out to see you a couple of years ago, we talked about the implications of strength training across a variety of diseases, diabetes, high blood pressure, COPD, cancer, heart disease, you name it. And had a fairly good review of the literature and a nice discussion back at the time that I think was well received by a lot of your listeners. But that question has remained sort of gnawing at me in the back of my mind, which is that, what is the impact of gaining strength in people who've already been diagnosed with something? And can it actually change the trajectory of their disease? So I think that was really the impetus behind studying this. And you'll remember when we went out to dinner, you had introduced me to a friend of yours who had bypass surgery and who you had trained.
Yes.
Scott
Davidson. And
Scott Davidson, retired Air Force.
Retired Air Force.
And,
He's currently employed as an instructor in the simulator program out here at Shepherd, and so Scott's got a bunch of stories about flying B-52s, and I love to sit and listen to his crazy stories about the Strategic Air Command and things like that. But it's yes, he's still
he was
trained.
Just as eloquent over dinner, when we sat down and talked about his experience recovering from heart surgery, and he had gone through cardiac rehab, and then you took him on, and he said the first training session he had with you was the hardest thing he had ever done, right? So,
he's mentioned that several times. Still talks about it because. And I think the upshot of that is that cardiac rehab is it's silly, and it's not sufficiently challenging to actually make anything adapt, since there's essentially stress. And his impression, and I really didn't have him do much of anything. I think we had him squat the empty bar for a couple, 3 sets of 5. We bench pressed. Then we deadlifted 40 kilos, 88 pounds, for a couple of sets of 5. And then I had him push the prowler. And he told me, and at that point, he's like 3 months post-op. And he told me that this is about 5 times harder than anything they had ever had him doing cardiac rehab. And so this prompts the question: what the hell are they doing in cardiac rehab, Bill? I mean, god damn, this is what an opportunity they've wasted. They've got these people there. Yeah. They have them there. They have their attention, right? And what do they do with the opportunity? Nothing.
Right. So, the whole thing with cardiac rehab, out of full disclosure, the editor for this journal, for this special edition, was my wife, who's also a physician. And she and I had looked at the Yale experience with cardiac rehab. So we looked at the last, I can't remember how many patients, probably a couple hundred patients that had cardiac surgery and gone through cardiac rehab. Mm-hmm. And the impact is minuscule. And the reason we decided to do this was when you look at the literature on cardiac rehab and cardiac surgery, it's actually not that cleanly done, which is to say that patients who've only had a heart attack, patients who've had only a stent, and patients who've had cardiac surgery all generally lumped together for the purposes of the analysis. Yeah. And that, as you would expect, shows that, well, people do quite well. But when you look at the cohort that's only underwent cardiac surgery, what they can report is that their cardiorespiratory fitness, their VO2 max, improves dramatically, right? But it doesn't reach statistical significance.
Right.
Right? So you get a 40% in your
Let's clarify that for the people watching this thing. It improves significantly relative to their baseline, right? But it doesn't improve.
So to give it context,
right?
Patient starts with being able to do 2 METs of activity, which, to contextualize that, is basically walking slowly across a room with some assistance.
Right.
And they'll improve their METs by 50%.
So they got 3 METs.
3 METs, which is that you're still walking slowly across the room. Right.
This is all relative. The relative versus absolute situation that we run into in statistics all the time, right?
But when you look at what this does actually mean, when we looked at recurrent cardiac events, death, freedom from rehospitalization, all the sort of bad things that could happen to you after a heart operation, cardiac rehab makes no difference.
Right.
And it makes less of a difference if you're a woman, actually.
Really?
If you're a female.
Yeah. And that's interesting because it's widely recognized that females are at a much lower risk of cardiovascular disease than males.